Boker Tov Givrin.
Boker Tov.
Jeff Achi, Ma Shlomcha. Okay. Roger Achi, Ma Shlomcha.
Tov.
Michael Achi, Ma Shlomcha.
Tov.
All right. I didn't get anyone that said anything other than Tov. That's all right. Now, who can tell me? Greg, what did I say?
How are you doing?
Okay, but I prefixed it with the name and Achi. What's Achi mean? My brother. My brother. So I said, Jeff, my brother, how are you? And Roger, my brother, how are you? Michael, my brother, how are you? That doesn't mean all the rest of you aren't my brothers in Christ, too. But I just picked on a few there, and none of them choked. Did you notice that? They responded. Great. Fantastic. It was all Tov, but no one broke out of the mold. But that's good. Well, with that word to the wise, let's start with some words to the wise up here on the screen. And I want to talk to you a little bit about things to watch for in translation that will help guide you as you continue to do translation work. First thing is, whenever you have a wow plus a noun, a wow plus the noun, whether it's u Moshe, as you had on one translation exercise, or whatever you have. It's not like we asa that we had on the last worksheet. Okay, when you have the wow plus the noun, do not translate it as then. It does not mean then. Then belongs on the wayik tol form of the verb. Then, so we'll talk about more of that here in a second. But the and or but is what is used when it's on a noun. And or but. When it's but, there's a contrast being shown in the context. But never use then or so or thus or therefore or since when you're translating the wow that is attached to a noun. Save that for when it is attached to a verb. When you have we asa, like we had in the exercise that was turned back to you today, and he did, and he made, here, and it produced, it is not a wow consecutive. It is a wow correlative. As a wow correlative, how would you translate it? You could translate it as and. You can translate it as so or therefore or thus. And you have to look at context carefully there. But remember, this is not a wow consecutive. And when we have and or but, some of you are already attempting to translate it as now. Like now Moses with u Moshe. Don't use now unless it is the Hebrew word atah. Why? This is a simple thing that I'm just asking you to follow through for the next 2 semesters. Reserve the word now for temporal situations only. Do not utilize a logical now. It's confusing, it's ambiguous, and it depends very heavily on context, sometimes intonation of voice when you read as to how people take it. But it can be very easily misunderstood and taken as a present rather than a logical now. So try to avoid the word now unless you have the Hebrew word for it and it is clearly a chronological or a temporal, a time-oriented context rather than logic. And then, in addition to that, when you see lo, remember this lo is not. Okay? It is for him or to him. It is the lamed preposition plus that third masculine singular pronominal suffix. The negative is spelled differently. It is spelled with an aleph. It's pronounced the same, lo, but it has totally different usage and meaning. Again, remember, when you have a holem wow at the end of a word, it will normally be a third masculine singular pronominal suffix. That kind of pronominal suffix occurs on nouns and on prepositions. We have it here on the inseparable preposition lamed. Don't get locked into translating the lamed preposition always as to. Remember, it can mean for. And it has actually 17 different possible translations. Look at them in Holliday's lexicon sometime. Just take a look at the article and go through and look at all the different usages. I think there are 13 different types of usages and 17 different possible English translations for the Lamed. So don't get locked into always translating as two. And you'll find many cases where for will work far better. Like we did in Job 14, for a tree. For a tree, not to a tree. There is hope for a tree. If we say there is hope to a tree, it doesn't quite fit in English. When we have a phrase like this, Ruach Elohim Ra'ah. Tom, what's one observation you can give us from these three words?
You mean other than the fact like Elohim is God?
Okay, good. That's one clue. We know Elohim means God. That's not a small part of things here. Okay? All right, Gus, give us a second clue.
Ruach means spirit.
Okay, Ruach means spirit. Kyle, give us a third clue.
It's in construct?
Good. Ruach is in construct with Elohim, right? Okay? Now, who has a third, or excuse me, a fourth or a fifth clue about this verse, an observation, or this phrase, excuse me? James Wood, can you give us another observation? We've had Elohim as God, Ruach is in construct with it, and Ruach means spirit. What else?
The verb is behind the subject.
Is there a verb here? Okay. Ra'ah could be a verb, but if it's a verb, it would be a third masculine singular, correct? Cal, perfect third masculine singular. We just had it in vocabulary. He shepherded, he pastured. Okay, but why can't that be the verb? What would be the subject if that's the verb? If Ruach Elohim is in construct, what would be the subject of this verb? Spirit. What gender of noun is spirit? Feminine. Therefore, Ra'ah cannot be a verb, and if it is, Ruach cannot be the subject of it. So if it's not a verb, what is another option, keeping in mind that Ruach is feminine? John Strickland?
An adjective.
An adjective. Adjective, feminine, singular in form, modifying Ruach. Now, back up a minute. Ruach, if it's in construct to Elohim, then would refer to the Spirit of God, right? Because if God is a proper noun, a name, and Ruach is in construct, then Ruach becomes definite. So how do we resolve this seeming conflict? Anyone got an idea? A clue? Go ahead, Chad.
I don't have a clue. Actually, I don't have a clue, but what's the conflict? I wasn't clear on what the conflict is.
We have two conflicts.
Okay.
Ra'ah cannot be the verb because Ruach would be the subject and it's feminine and the verb is masculine. Okay? If Ra'ah is an adjective agrees with the noun it modifies in what? Gender, number, and definiteness. But Ruach will be definite because it is in construct with a definite noun, Elohim, a proper name. So we have a seeming conflict. So how do we resolve it? Anyone have a clue? Kelly, any ideas?
Could it be that it would be an understood article since it's an understood article with Elohim? It's not present, so then it would just be understood with the adjective.
Okay, that is good thinking, but wrong here. Okay, James. Or David, rather, excuse me. James is sitting over there.
Elohim.
He's sitting there saying, I didn't raise my hand. Go ahead.
Elohim may not be definite, it may not be the defined name of God, it just might be referring to a generic God.
That is another excellent thought, but wrong. Eric, any ideas?
No, that's fine.
Okay. Jan.
Is there a word is must be present because if there's no article?
No, there is here will not be present in this particular phrase, but that again is a good thing to think about. In case it is a noun clause, you'd have to supply the verb is. It's not going to be true here. Okay, now 3 very good clues to look at, or ideas, concepts of where to go. They happen to be wrong, and they're only wrong because the context demonstrates that they're wrong, not this phrase by itself. All right? So those were good ideas. Here is the solution. The solution is that in Hebrew, the adjective can sometimes become the clue and the defining element to help resolve an issue like what we have here. Since the adjective has to agree with the noun it modifies in definiteness as well as in gender and number, it is forcing the issue here. And in reality, this would be translated an evil spirit from God. Now, spirit of God here is going to prove to be a genitive of source. A genitive of source. And it's going to be forced to be indefinite to go contrary to the normal rule. Remember, I've told you, I think, many times, for every rule in Hebrew, there's an exception. And this is one of those exceptions. By putting ra'ah here, it forces then ruach to be taken as an indefinite, and it is an evil spirit from God. This is from 1 Samuel 16. It's talking about an evil spirit from God that comes upon King Saul. And that is what resolves it here. It's not the evil spirit of God. It is an evil spirit from God. And that'd be good for you to remember because sometime in the near future you're going to have a translation assignment for 1 Samuel chapter 16. Yes, John?
Do we only know it's not an evil spirit of God because God can't have an evil spirit, but by the theology?
That's absolutely correct. That plus the context. The context indicates it's a spirit sent from God.
Well, I was just wondering if somebody was, critical of scriptures could come to this and say, see, God could have an evil spirit and use and say grammatically I can prove that.
Yeah, but it'd be grammar without regard to context. You can prove anything with grammar if you ignore context. Okay? Roger?
Where do you get from?
That's the genitive of source. Turn with me, you were to continue your reading in Putnam. So let's turn there to section 1.8.1. Okay, 1.8.1. 1.8.1 has to do with the construct. Remember, you to bring Hebrew Bible insert with you to class. And notice as you go down through here that there are 3 different types of construct chains. First of all, 1.8.1a, subjective chains. In subjective chains, the first noun, noun 1, implies or entails a verbal idea. And it behaves this way to where the subject, noun number 2, is the subject of the action. So if you have here, see Yahweh's salvation, literally, Yeshuat Yahweh, the salvation of Yahweh. It's not Yahweh as the object of salvation. Yahweh is the subject of salvation. So that is called a subjective genitive. Okay? And then this same type of subjective genitive chain can take place as a possessive. Noun number 1 belongs to or is the property of noun number 2. So Hekal Yahweh is the palace or the temple of Yahweh or Yahweh's temple. And then third, origin or source, including authorship. Noun number 2 is the author or source of noun 1, such as Divrei Lemuel, the words of Lemuel. Okay, and that's what we have here, a spirit from God. God is the source of the spirit. And this is demonstrated also in the context. Human relationship. You are my son. My son, son of me, son of me. And so it's relationship. Then we have objective genitive chains. And we have the objective genitive is where there is the head noun, noun number one, brings about or causes the condition named by noun number two. So we have the delighting of the heart, misamche lave, the rejoicings of the heart. And so it is then what? The heart is caused to rejoice, is the idea. The heart is the object of it. Result. Noun number one accomplishes or brings about the result named in noun number two. Musar shlomenu, the punishment that brought about our peace. Literally, the punishment of our peace, the chastisement of our peace in Isaiah 53:5. It's the result. And then you have location or goal, you have advantage or disadvantage, and then we have the attributive chains. Attributive, very simple one, my holy mountain, Har Kadshi. Second one, epexegetical, explains. Noun number two, explains. Cows that were attractive to see, foreseeing, and just explains. Material, mice of gold. Gold here is saying golden mice then, material. Measure or number, the partitive has the idea of out of, so half of, half out of, half from the people of Israel. Chetzi, half of, am people. And then
species, where noun number two is a subclass of noun number one. We have here etsei erazim, and this is the idea of wood of cedar, meaning cedar wood, or trees of cedar, meaning cedar trees. We have not only specification of species, but we have special specification with regard to the land of Shinar. In other words, the land that is Shinar. The genus, sometimes you have a wild ass of a man, for example, Pere Adam, where noun number two names the larger class that noun number one belongs to. Superlative, Shir Hashirim, literally the song of songs, means the best song. And we have content, a donkey loaded with bread, literally a donkey of bread. Now, it doesn't mean a donkey made of bread, it's a donkey loaded with bread, so it's content. And so those you'll find are 18, 10 attributive, 4 subjective, and 4 objective uses of the construct state. It's all the same form, but context determines the kinds of usages. Okay? Scott?
Regarding that 1.18b, the object and delighting the heart, it seems kind of to go to our exercise today with the scent of waters. How do you get the definiteness out of that form?
Well, in the delighting of the heart, that is in the context where you're dealing with that in Psalm 19, requires that you put the because it's speaking generically of people and talking about the heart, and in English we supply the. Again, it's going to be sensitive to context and also sensitive to English usage. And every noun is not treated the same way in English. And it's not treated the same way in every context. Okay? All right, other questions? Okay, so that's why we have source here, an evil spirit from God. You cannot determine that on this phrase with these 3 words by themselves. You have to have the context to fill that in and make that a true possibility. So as we're thinking about 18 different functions, 18 different uses of the construct state in Hebrew, we're not talking about 18 different forms where you can look at a form and you can identify immediately by form. We're talking about usages that are defined in actuality by context, but they're proven by a tabulation of all the construct states in all the Hebrew Bible to be 18, at least 18 basic usages by context of the genitive, of the construct state. And so those uses are what are listed there. And those uses are, and this is not using the term grammatically, all right? They are subjective. By that I mean that it is subject to our understanding of the context. It's not objective in the sense that you look at the form and you say the form demands this. It's interpretive on the basis of context. So please keep that in mind. Sometimes we get to talking about such things, whether it's in Greek or whether it's in Hebrew. We start talking about different types of genitives. We start talking about different types of aorists in the Greek. We start talking about different kinds of imperfects in the Hebrew, as though there were separate forms for all of these, when there is not. These are categories of possible or potential usage that are determined by the context in which that grammar is utilized. That's all we're talking about. Okay? All right? Let's move on then. When you see a string of Wayik-Tol verbs, so far you've been translating individual verses. I think once we had 2 verses in a row, or it's this coming exercise that has it. When you're doing that, watch for Wayik-Tols. Wayik-Tols are a clue that you're probably dealing with narrative. 90% or more of the time you're dealing with narrative. Narrative is by its nature past tense. So translate them as past tense. Okay? And as you look at these, you have Wayomer, 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 Wayishlak. Now, how do we translate that? Do we go across here and say, and he said, and he said, and he said, and he sent? No. Do not do that. That is monotonous and unrealistic and unnatural in English. And it denies the function of Wayik-Tol in the Hebrew. It seeks to just conform it to an overly literal wooden translation. Utilize, then he said, so he replied. He said, therefore he sent. This is from a real context, and what you've got to watch out for is the flow of the context and what's occurring. You may start with a temporal, chronological sequence, then he said, and then so he replied. Or you could just say he replied and not even say so, because replied shows that it's sequence to the preceding. He said, here I didn't even translate it. There are times when you don't translate, but don't ignore all the wows on Wayik-Tol. Don't treat them all that way. If you have a chain of them, make certain that the sequence is clear by your translation. Don't give your readers or your hearers the idea or concept that the chain broke somewhere. Make certain it's clear that the sequence is intact. And then therefore he sent. So sometimes it's chronological sequence, sometimes it's logical sequence that you use. And there's a whole slew of words you can use. And can be used. I mean, you can have it even on Wayik-Tol. You can have 2 Wayik-Tols so close together with nothing else said that it only makes sense in English and is only smooth in English if you said and between the 2. He went and he spoke. If you have a longer thing, he went to the town to purchase a new car and he spoke to the manager. You have too much in between there to just use and. But if it's he went and he spoke, nothing else in between, then you can get away with using and. That's not a problem. But then, so, thus, therefore, there's some situations when will work. And we'll talk about those as we run into them. Don't try to use it all the time, because sometimes when it's used, it seeks to mask the relationships, and you have to make certain that it's going to fit, because when is normally a subordinate type of relationship. Then, because the Wayik-Tol can be a logical relationship of sequence where you have cause and effect, and you can have a because in there. Because he went to town, he met the sheriff, you see. And that can be Wayik-Tols there. If, sometimes they're conditional sentences, since, and then sometimes you just use nothing to represent the and. But don't use and over and over and over again. We call this characteristic of classical Hebrew polysyndeton. Polysyndeton breaks down to many connections. 2 Greek words. Palu and syndeton. And it has the idea of many connections. And there's many ands. We call it polysyndeton because the Hebrew narrative just goes and, as far as the wow conjunction is concerned. But it is not that simple. It's not just a simple conjunction and. These verbs are sequential, and the sequence must be preserved in translation, and we use sequential adverbs. In fact, when we study Wayik-Tol, in all reality, that wow so-called conjunction is not really a conjunction, it's an adverb. And we know that from the Semitic languages related to Egypt, that there it took, this was an adverbial form that was used on the verbs. G.R. Driver brought that out back in the 1940s and said, look at this, it's identical to the usage in Hebrew. And this actually behaves as an adverb, and he suggested that and said we ought to consider it. And too many have ignored it. But it really, it does show an adverbial relationship, and sometimes there will be adverbial translations like when and because and if and since. Okay? Any questions before we move on? One more review before we move on. Yes, Scott.
I'm sorry, I was trying to find an example, but there was a couple words when I looked them up in Holiday. They had the wow in the word, and when I didn't expect it to be there. Why would it be in one of the parsing options in Holiday attached? Does it mean that that verb tells us because of the type of verb it is that it would have to have an and, or?
No, it's telling you that that particular form is available, and sometimes that particular form is different, like we had with wa yisater in the exercise I just turned back to you. The shortened form of the Hirik Yod infix, that would be shown there. Let's turn there to Sather. I believe that's a good place to go. That would be on page 260. 260. And they don't give it on that one. They do give the simple wow on the perfix, but they didn't give it there. Oh, wait a minute. That's nifal. Let's look at the hifil. Yeah, we do have it on the hifil. On page 261, left-hand column, up there at the top, look under the hifil, and we have there the perfect forms and then the imperfect. And notice the imperfect, yastir, but wayaster. Wayaster. Why does it give that? Because the wow of the Wayik-Tol attached to this verb shortens the Hirik Yod to a tseri, to an E-class vowel. And so they give you the forms with a wow on it because sometimes the wow is added, it changes the form of the verb. So it's given as an example. Okay? All right? All right, a quick review on the verb conjugations. When we talk about the perfix, what is our clue for identifying the conjugation or stem of the Hebrew verb in the perfect? What's the one clue? You can say it in one word. No. No. That will not identify what stem it is, whether it's kal, nifal, hifil, hafal, etc. What's the one word? 4 letters in the word. Name. Name. The name of the stem or conjugation helps you to identify the perfect. All right? In the kal, katal. It doesn't sound like hifil. All right? In the nifal, niktal. Just like nifal, niktal. The name identifies it. That's the simple roots, or stems rather, simple stems or conjugations. Hifil, hiktil, hifil. Notice the name is like the form. Hiktil, hifil. The hofal, hoktal, hofal. Same sound, and these are the causatives. And then we go to the factatives. Piel, kitel. Notice the sound. Piel, kitel. The sound of the name identifies the form. Pu'al, kutal, pu'al. This is the factative. The hithpa'el, hithkatel, hithpa'el. The sounds. Pay attention to the sounds. It's the name of the stem or the conjugation that will identify the verbs in the perfect forms. Now, sometimes a vowel or two will change. Usually it's just one of these vowels will change. The prefixes will remain the same when you add the suffixes on it. But they all come out. If you look in your syllabus, or not in your syllabus, in your textbook, if you go back to your textbook and you go to page 143, where you have the chart of the regular verb, and let's just take the first common singular form as an example. Katalti, cow. It does not sound like hifil. It does not sound like nifal, but go to the nifal. Niktalti, niktalti, nifal. It does not sound like hifil. It does not sound like hithpael. It does not sound like pual. Go to the pl. Kitalti, ki, notice, kitalti, pal. The A has disappeared, but the E is still there. Only one vowel has changed, but notice you still have a doubling doggish in there also, in the second root letter. Pual, kutalti, kutalti, pual. It's as though you added the T to pual, pualti. You see? That's all you're doing. Look at the hifil. Hiktalti, hiktalti. Okay, so it doesn't have hiktilti. That's too many E's in a row for Hebrew. You go down further and you have hiktila in the third feminine singular. You have hiktilu in the third common plural. But all of these have he. You don't have a he at the beginning of the nifal. You don't have a he at the beginning of the pl and pual. The only other one that has he is the hithpael, and you can tell it's formed because it has the tau in there. Because it's not just he, it's hith. Okay, so you have haktalti for the hof vowel. No one else has a ha in the beginning. And hithkatalti with the hith. No other form. You see, the name identifies, even if one of the main vowels changes in the name, even if you add a different suffix on it, that prefix and the initial vowels pretty much stay the same, unless you have a guttural interfere. And a guttural will cause trouble because it will reject doubling, and there's some form of compensation will go on, and it prefers A-class vowels, and so that will go on. But you are aware of that because you know what the gutturals are. You can identify them. There are 5 of them. Kempis, name the 5 gutturals.
Aleph, Ayin, Resh, weak, and Hey, and Hey.
Good. You have Aleph, Hey, Cheth, Ayin, and Resh. And Resh is sometimes, right? Those are the 5 gutturals. We have 3 rules for them. What are the 3 rules? Prefer A-class vowels? Reject doubling and prefer compound schwa. So we know that. We're aware of that. We're not clueless. So when you run into changes that you say, wow, I see the same prefix and stuff here, but it just doesn't make any sense to me. It makes sense because of the gutturals. Always take the gutturals into account when you're looking at it. All right? In the imperfect, where do we go for the clue as to what stem or conjugation it is, whether it's cal, nifil, hifil, hafal? Where do we go? What's our clue? One clue. As in the perfect, the clue is the name. What's the clue for the imperfect? The prefix what? The prefix vowel. The prefix vowel is where we go. We know that all imperfects are prefix verbs. Okay? Just as we know all perfects are suffix verbs. And we know what the imperfect prefixes look like. We have yods, we have taus, and we have aleph and nun. The aleph and nun occur in the first person. Aleph is first person common singular. The nun prefix is first person common plural. And we know that the taus and the yods go elsewhere. The yods primarily stay with the third person, and the taus go with third and second person. So we know what the prefixes are on imperfects. But what we want is to look for the vowel under the prefix to identify the verb conjugation. In the cal, yiktol. In the nifal, yikatail. All right? What is the vowel? Hirik. And how do we remember that? We remember it because the vowel in simple is I, and this is an I-class vowel. These are the simple stems. The simple stems have I-class vowels. Okay? How do we know the difference between a nifal and a cal imperfect? 2 clues, but one is the biggest. Pardon? More than the comets. More than the doubling dogish plus comets. The triangle. Hirik, comets, and dogish. Those 3, the nifal triangle. That's your big clue. The cal won't have a nifal triangle. And cal has normally got an O-class vowel back there. Not always, but normally. Okay, so the nifal triangle is the big determining factor to distinguish the 2 different stems or conjugations that have a hirik under the prefix of the imperfect. Then we go to the hifil, yaktil, and the hofal, yaktal. What is our clue here? What are we looking at here with regard to prefix vowel? A-class vowels, the A as in causative. All right? Easy, simple way of association of remembering it. Now, how do we tell the difference between these 2? The middle, the hirik yod, infix, on the hifil. Now, remember, sometimes that yod can drop out, and sometimes it can be shortened to a tsere or even to a segol. But that I or E-class vowel will be there under the second root letter in the hifil, and very often the hirik yod infix. On the hofal, remember the hofal, because that first comets is in a closed, unaccented syllable, it is in reality not really an A-class vowel, is it? What is it? It's an O or U-class vowel, and actually it's a U-class vowel. It's a comets hatuf. Comets hatuf. And so in some forms of the hofal, you'll see a U-class vowel substituted here. And you'll find a shurik there after that. So watch out for that when we come to it. But keep in mind, it's because the hofal, yaktal, is a closed, unaccented syllable. Therefore, the comets is a comets hatuf. Comets hatuf. Okay? So some have said perhaps the name shouldn't be hofal, but should be hufal. Only problem is it's still pronounced hoktal in most of the occurrences. All right? Now, the piel, yikatail, the pual, yekutal. What do we have here as the prefix vowel? The schwa. And the schwa is silent. And here we're just punting because you have a silent E on the end of simple, you have a silent E on the end of causative, you have a silent E on the end of factative. So the association here isn't very good. But remember that the PL and PUAL have schwas under the prefix in the imperfect. All right? Now, how do we tell the difference between these 2? They both have a doubling dogish in the second root letter. Okay, the kibbutz is the primary one. Watch for that kibbutz. The U-class vowel in the pual will stay. Okay, that is the clue. All right, then we go to the hithpael, and we have a hirik under it, but it's that tau is there with it. So we don't really have to look at the vowel on the hithpael because we always have that tau to help out. Okay? And I say always, that's relatively speaking. There are exceptions that we have to talk about later today. Okay? Now, the participle. What is the form of the cal participle active? Anyone? O-A, co-tail, right? And what's the passive participle?
Right, katul. Katul, it's got the shurik, okay? Kotail in the cal, active participle. We have niktal in the nifal. These are the simple stems. And here I'm just giving the active participles. You have a passive participle. The one passive participle where you have active and passive for the same stem is in the cal. It has katul for the passive, niktal for the nifal, hifil and hofal, maktil, maktal. What are you noticing here? What are you noticing about clues that help out? The vowel. The vowel under the prefix of the participle, if a prefix for the participle exists. There is no prefix on the cal participles. But if there is a prefix, the vowel is the same as in the imperfect. The vowel is the same as in the imperfect. Maktil has the infixed hirik yod, just like everything else, and the pathic under the prefix, the kamet satuf under the mem and the hafal. So just like the imperfect, notice the pl and pual on the factive, the schwa, just like in the imperfect. And notice we have a mem prefix on all participles except the simple stems. A mem prefix on all participles except the simple stems. Let's back up a minute and take a look at that previous slide. What makes the difference between the nifal perfect and the nifal participle? What's the difference between nifal perfect and nifal participle? No? What? Pardon?
Name.
Not the main. There's no maim on the nifal here. Between pathic and comments, correct. Nifal is the name. The name goes with the perfect. This is niktal, not nifal. Niktal, the comments there, goes as, that identifies it as being the participle. That's the only difference between the nifal perfect, third masculine singular, and the nifal participle masculine singular, is the difference is a pathic in the perfect and a comments in the participle. Because remember, the name goes with the what? Perfect. The name goes with the perfect, not with the participle. Okay? The PL and PUAL participles, schwas, just like in the imperfect prefixes. And the hithpael also has a meme, myth, still has the tau, so myth cattail still fits in the participle form. All right, let's cover one more here. I'm not covering the imperatives, and I'm not covering the infinitive constructs. Why? They're basically the imperfect of the second person minus the prefix. Okay? So we don't really need to cover it. If you know the imperfects and you know the imperfect form, all you have to do is take the prefix off and make the adjustments if there's two schwas in a row, and you've got it made. So let's go to the infinitive absolute. Remember that abso, because, it's katol in the cal. The nifal, hikatol, that O is still there. It's absolute, okay? Simple stems. Haktail changes, no holum, but it's not a hirik yod. The hirik yod is in the imperfect, therefore will be in the infinitive construct, but not in the absolute. Hoktail. Notice that the two causative stems both have a tsere for the infinitive absolute. And it has the he prefix, and it has the he prefix has the imperfect vowel, the imperfect prefix vowel. Yaktil, haktail. Yaktal, hoktail. Notice the prefix vowel, the he's here, are the same as the prefix vowels in the imperfect. But they don't follow the pointing of the imperfect in the second root letter. And the PL, katol. Notice the doubling dogish in the second root letter. Kutol. Notice the doubling dogish, but notice also that's a holum. Absolute. Okay? Absolute. And then the hithpael, hithkatol. So you have only two
stems or conjugations that do not have a holum as the vowel for the middle root letter in the infinitive absolute. Both of them are the causative. The hifil, hack tail, and the hofal, hawk tail. Both of those use the tsere. Okay, question, David.
On page 143, for the hip-pi-ale infinitive absolute, the last vowel is tsere.
Let's see, I got to get down here to, you're talking about the piale?
Hip-pi-ale.
Oh, the hifpile, excuse me. Hifcattail is one form, but hifcattol also occurs. Okay? The hifcattail does occur, though. And that causes confusion because it's identical to the infinitive construct.
Is that common then to have either a tsere or a holum?
It occurs in the causative stems. You can have it occur, yes. Mm-hmm. The holum is the one you first look for. First look for the holum. Okay? All right. Are you experiencing technical difficulties? A week ago, we had to buy a new DVD player because the old DVD player was no longer playing the DVDs. And it just freeze. Freeze in the middle of a sermon, freeze in the middle of a scene in Jerusalem, freeze in the middle of a movie on our date nights, whatever. You know, it got very frustrating. Have the grandchildren over, and the DVD player would freeze on me. And we're trying to watch something with the grandchildren. So we went out and bought a brand new DVD player. And had to get it all set up correctly. And it had all these things. A new remote had to be configured to the TV and everything else. And all the wiring had to be done. It had to be redone in this case, a little bit differently than the old one. So I was having technical difficulties. And I know that my little 6-year-old grandson probably could have put together in 5 minutes. It took Grandpa an hour and a half to get it all done. So I was having technical difficulties. And some of you have technical difficulties when you come to the Hebrew text and you're trying to do translation. And these are the things that I'm hammering over and over and over again that are the clues that will help you when you're having those problems. And that is, first of all, the rules for gutturals. We have not yet dealt with the weak verbs, which are a large number of verbs in the Hebrew language. We've dealt with a strong verb, where it has 3 strong consonants in the root. For example, we've used quite often the word kafav, because kafav has 3 non-gutturals. Okay? We've used katal, 3 non-gutturals. We've used shamer, and shamer does have a sometimes guttural, but it's in the 3rd position, and in the 3rd position, it's not affected by hardly anything. So it's almost like a strong consonant, shamer. We've had malak, he reigned, he ruled. 3 consonants, none of them are gutturals. So this is what we call the strong verb in its forms. The weak verb changes all of this. The weak verb comes along and does things like putting a middle vowel in the center, shuv, to return. It does things like putting a noon on the front of he gave, Nathan. It does things like putting a yod, like yashav, and the yod is going to prove to be weak. And it does things like putting an ayin at the beginning of a word, and not only that, this is doubly weak because it has a silent guttural at the end, asa. And we have a silent lamed at the end in Malay. We have an initial aleph in Amer that creates difficulties. You saw that with Wayomer. Here you have an O-class vowel where you've never seen one before with a prefix or with any form of the cal imperfect. Those are called weak verbs. But all of these behave in logical fashion for the most part. And it's all due to the 3 rules for gutturals. That's why it is so very, very important. You memorize the strong verb form in the cal. You learn the clues for identifying the other 6 stems or conjugations with regard to their prefixes, their infixes, their suffixes are all the same as the strong verb. That doesn't change for the different verb forms. The imperfect prefixes don't change the consonants just because it's a weak form. But the vowels change. And that all has to do with the gutturals. So that's one of the things you've got to pay attention to and watch very, very carefully. And remember, you need to know the forms of the personal pronouns, because the forms of the personal pronouns provide you with the clues to the suffixes on the perfect forms of the verb. Katalti. The E is from ani, anoki. Katalta. The ta is from atta. Kataltim. The tim is from atim. You need to know those suffixes, and to know those suffixes, you need to remember the personal pronouns. So if you improperly parse a form, it's because you do not have memorized the personal pronouns. Not because you failed to memorize the hithpa-ale in all its forms, because you don't have to memorize it in all its forms. Because the same thing applies with regard to personal pronouns and suffixes on all 7 conjugations of the Hebrew verb. The names of the verb stems, we just went over that with the perfix. They are the clue for the perfix. And they provide a good deal of evidence for some help on some of the imperfects as well. But it's primarily the perfix. The verb prefixes and suffixes. If you learn the prefixes and suffixes of all the forms for the cal, you only have 2 differences from those prefixes and suffixes elsewhere in the entire chart of verbs that you have here. All right? What are those differences? First of all, you have the differences due to stem where they require, like the nifal, a noon prefix, the hifil and hafal, a hay prefix, and the hay prefix on the nifal, imperative and infinitives. Those are unusual. So you have to learn those. They're separate. But all the other things are the same. Every imperfect, whether it's a hithpa-ale, a hafal, or a nifal, or if it's a cal, every third masculine singular imperfect begins with the same yod prefix. Just a different vowel under it depending on what stem it is. The noun prefixes and suffixes, this is important. You have to know that a masculine plural noun ends in im, that a feminine plural noun ends in oth. And that helps you also to identify the endings of participles, because participles are pointed as nouns. They take articles, they take noun suffixes. Learn the construct state forms of these as well on the nouns. And then what's left? Basically, particles. Particles like ki, for, because, like yesh, there is, like lo, not, al, not, and the prepositions, all those little tiny words that are normally not inflected. They do not have endings on them for person, gender, and number. They're isolated, they're individual forms. Those particles, whether conjunctions or adverbs or prepositions, those are the little particles that add color to your black and white TV view of Hebrew. All right? Because they show relationships. They identify things, emphases and relationships. And so the particles are an area where you just have to memorize a certain number of particles and know what they are. And that's just pure memorization. And that memorization is going to be helped by repetition more than anything else, learning what those are. Those are your biggest helps to solving translation problems when you're having technical difficulties. And these are basics. They're very basic. They're things we covered last semester for the most part, and we've reiterated this semester and are filling them out and completing them. At this stage of learning Hebrew, you have enough Hebrew that with the help of this lexicon, you can translate and you can parse and identify every verb in every form in the entire Hebrew Bible with the exception of about 5%. In other words, you could get 95% on any quiz or exam on any text of Scripture with a lexicon in hand, with what you've learned so far. And in the days ahead, we're going to begin to demonstrate that to you. We're going to continue to re-emphasize these areas and to illustrate them. And as we add the weak verbs, this is my warning to you. When we get into weak verbs, you're going to become weak-hearted because of all the exceptions and all the things that take place. But remember, on the weak verbs, you don't have to memorize every single paradigm of every single weak verb. You need to remember these clues, and you need to be aware of what can happen in regard to some of these clues. And if you remember that, you will make it through without hardly any problems at all. Plus that, later in the textbook, we'll provide you a 2-page summary that will help you to identify, and you'll keep that with you whenever you're doing translation for any workbook assignment or when you're doing translation in the Hebrew text. You'll keep that open and you'll utilize it because it will resolve about 90% of all the difficulties of weak verbs. In that 5% where you have a problem out of the text, in that 5%, 90% plus will be solved by those charts. And that leaves you then with a less than 0.25%. I think it's like 0.5% of areas that are still so difficult that you'll need help elsewhere, like a grammar or a technical book of some sort, or have to use a parsing guide. And in those situations, that's very minimal and very small because you'll have enough to solve all of these. And I'll just apply the rules as we go along, and I'll do that from time to time. I'll just ask you, okay, what are the clues? And we just put it together. We watch it. It's playing detective. Okay. One more thing before we go to the exercise that's due today and look at it. When we talked about the Hithpael, and I told you that the Hithpael always has that tau there. The Hith-katel, the Hith-shamer, and the Yith-katel in the imperfect. Well, as I said, there's an exception to every rule. You will not always have that tau there in the Hithpael. And there are specific reasons for these Hithpael glitches or Hithpael hitches, to keep it alliterated. First of all, if there is a sibilant is an S sound. Any S-sounding consonant that you have at the beginning of a root word will affect the form of the Hithpael. What are some of the Hebrew letters that are S sound? Samic, okay. What else? Sheen, seen. Not, sere is a vowel. Sade, one more. You think it more of a Z. Zion. Zion. These 5 are called sibilants. Now remember, before you had to remember what labials were. The beth, the mem, and the pay as labials because it affected, especially like adding a conjunction to it. But now we're dealing with sibilants. And when we have a sibilant as the first letter, for example, samach, he was glad, he rejoiced. Zakar, he remembered. Seem, he put, he placed. Shuv, to return. Trying to think of a tzadeh form here. Can't think of one right offhand. But any verb root that begins with a sibilant, the samic, the sheen, the seen, the tzadeh, and the zion, these will do something different in the Hithpael. When the first letter is a sibilant, the Hith Shapek that you would expect for Shafak, he poured out with regard to himself here, changes those middle two around, switches place. Did you see that? Transposition, we call that metathesis. They change places. You shift them. And that is called metathesis. M-E-T-A-T-H-E-S-I-S. Metathesis. So it becomes Hishtafek instead of Hithshafek. All right? So keep that in mind when you're looking. Look for the tau to come after the sibilant in the Hithpael form. Wayith Sabel will change. The tau will switch places with the samic. It becomes Wayis Tabel. Okay? It changes places. The metathesis takes place. Hith Sayadnu. Hith Sayadnu from Sayad becomes Hitz Tayadnu. Notice here what happened. After the Tzadeh, the tau changed to a taith. That's the second trick. All right? That's the second trick. The vowels stay the same. The vowels stay the same. Okay? It's just you're switching places with the sibilant and the tau, and in this case, the tau changed to a taith. Now, how would you know what to do with this? Well, as you're looking at this form, you see a hey, you can say, well, that's a prefix. You see the u, you know the u is a suffix, but the nu can also be a suffix. So you look at it further and you say, uh-oh, I've got 4 strong consonants. A tzadi, a taith, a yod. Notice the yod is a consonant because it's doubled and has its own vowel under it. It's not behaving as a vowel letter. It is a consonant here. And a daleth. We don't have normally 4-letter root words in Hebrew. It has to be 3. And to get that 3 then, you suddenly realize, oh, tzadi is a sibilant. It may have switched places with the tau, and the tau's become a taith, so the root is tzadi, yod, daleth. And the nu is first common plural suffix on a perfect, and this is a perfect. Because you switch that back, it's hith. Okay? Now the assimilation of dentals. When a first root letter is dental, a tau, a taith, or a daleth, and sometimes when you have a nun or a zayin, which are not dentals, hith taharu becomes hittaheru. Notice again what happens. Hith taharu, the tau assimilates into the following taith. The 2 dentals in a row, the first dental assimilates into the other, and it's compensated for by a doubling dogish. It becomes hittaharu. All right? And why is it there's no doubling dogish in the hey? It's a guttural. It refuses it to begin with. All right? So the doubling dogish in the taith stands for the assimilated tau. Hith taheru. From taher, which has the meaning of he cleansed, he purified. This is they cleansed themselves. They purified themselves. And the hith, the tau, will assimilate to the taith, the 2 dentals in a row. The first dental will disappear into the second dental and be shown by a doubling dogish. Okay? And that can occur with a tau and a taith, a tau and a daleth. And it can also occur sometimes with a tau and a noon, or a tau and a zayin, where the tau assimilates and becomes a doubling dogish in the daleth, the taith, the zayin, or the noon. And if the root itself begins with a tau, 2 taus in a row also creates a problem, so it'll assimilate into the second tau as well. John?
I missed it. Does the first dental become assimilate into the second, or?
No, the first assimilates into the second. The second stays.
Second stays, got it.
The taith stays, the daleth stays, and instead the first tau, the tau that's characteristic of hith-pa'el, is what assimilates. It's the prefix tau that assimilates. Okay, the prefix tau assimilates. That's your question, Kelly? Okay, Scott?
Our 3 root letters always stay then. We never, as far
Your
as
3
using
root
holidays.
letters will normally stay, but there are a lot of weak verbs where that will not be true. In the weak verbs, you'll often have only 2 showing, and there's some in which you'll have only 1 letter showing.